In the 416 core, we've seen very little, if hardly any, price reduction. But when you go out into the suburbs, there are significant reductions. If you look at Durham.
Toronto's housing market didn't just cool, it crashed. Condo towers that once symbolized wealth now stand half empty, and homeowners who bragged about million-dollar gains are suddenly begging for buyers. Families are underwater, jobs are vanishing, and Ontario's proudest achievement has turned into its biggest nightmare. In the middle of it all, the Premier, once calm and confident, snapped on live television, his frustration boiling over as cameras rolled. How did Ontario's golden empire of glass and steel crumble so fast? And what happens when even its leader starts to break? Ontario's golden era of real estate.
To be rented out, and simply a massive overbuilding of non-family units, non-800, 900 square foot units. Those hardly exist in most.
There was a time when Ontario's housing market felt unstoppable, like the province had found its own version of gold. Toronto's skyline was alive with cranes, each one promising another glittering condo tower. People used to joke that the official bird of Ontario was the construction crane. Every corner of the city buzzed with new developments. Pre-construction units were snatched up before sales offices even opened. You'd hear stories about buyers camping outside overnight just for a chance to sign papers. Homes in the suburbs were going for hundreds of thousands over asking, and bidding wars weren't just common, they were expected. It didn't matter if it was a 2-bedroom condo downtown or a 3-bedroom in Mississauga. If it had a roof, it was a prize. The air back then was thick with confidence. Everyone was in on it. Neighbors compared how much their homes had appreciated in a single year. Dinner parties turned into investment strategy sessions. People who'd never flipped a house before were suddenly real estate experts. There was this unshakable belief that housing wasn't just a safe bet, it was the safest. Even the Premier joined the chorus, boasting that Ontario's booming real estate was proof of the province's strength. It became a point of pride. Owning property wasn't just about having a place to live, it was about being smart, successful, and part of something unstoppable. The fuel behind this frenzy was a perfect storm of opportunity. Interest rates were at record lows, so borrowing money felt effortless. Banks were practically handing out mortgages and people took them without thinking twice. You could buy a house, wait a few months, and sell it for a massive profit. Foreign investors poured in, seeing Toronto as a safe haven for their money. Entire condo floors were bought up in single transactions. Some units never even had lights turned on. They were simply assets waiting to appreciate. The city became a playground for global money, and the line between homeownership and speculation blurred completely. The frenzy spread far beyond Toronto. Hamilton, once an industrial town known for its steel mills, suddenly rebranded itself as the Brooklyn of Toronto. Kitchener and Waterloo were flooded with buyers chasing cheaper land and higher returns. Even quiet towns like Peterborough and Windsor saw bidding wars that made lifelong locals shake their heads. Remote work made distance irrelevant, and everyone wanted their slice of the pie. Developers couldn't build fast enough. Every project launch felt like a festival. Buyers dressed in suits and sneakers, waving deposit checks like golden tickets. It was a time when everyone thought they'd cracked the system. The media glorified it, politicians praised it, and anyone who warned about a bubble was brushed off as a pessimist. The phrase "real estate never goes down" was practically gospel. People mortgaged their futures for the promise of endless appreciation. And for a while it worked. Prices soared, wealth ballooned, and Ontario felt invincible. But behind all that glitter and glass, the cracks were already forming. No one wanted to admit it, but deep down, some wondered how long the music could keep playing before someone turned off the lights. Ontario's housing market wasn't just booming, it was intoxicating. And like all highs, it couldn't last forever. Cracks beneath the shine.
Factors that are driving that decline. One is consumer confidence. I mean, it's no surprise to anybody we're in a period of turmoil, tariffs, etc., and people are just sitting on the...
At first, nobody wanted to believe anything could go wrong. The headlines were too good, the profits too easy, and the mood too euphoric. Ontario felt like the center of the world. Everybody wanted in, and nobody wanted out. But beneath the surface of this golden dream, the foundation was already shifting. Prices had climbed so fast that ordinary families were stretched to their limits, just trying to keep up. Wages barely moved, but home prices were sprinting ahead like they were in a different universe. People were taking out mortgages that swallowed half their paychecks, convincing themselves it was temporary. The banks approved it, the agents encouraged it, and the government cheered it on. Everyone was addicted to the idea that housing could only go up. It was around this time that a few economists started sounding alarms. They warned that Ontario's debt levels were getting dangerous, that families were borrowing more than they could ever realistically pay back if rates rose. But their voices were drowned out by the roar of bidding wars and the noise of easy success. Nobody wanted to hear bad news in a market where everyone felt like a genius. The media played along, spinning stories of 20-something investors flipping condos before they were even built. It all felt glamorous until it didn't. The warning signs were there, flashing bright red, but the province was too hypnotized by its own success to notice. Foreign money was flooding in too, distorting everything. Toronto condos were being bought in bulk by overseas investors who didn't even live in Canada. Some left their units empty, treating them like savings accounts with views. Local buyers couldn't compete, but politicians called it a sign of confidence. Behind the scenes, affordability was collapsing. Young couples earning honest paychecks were being pushed out of the cities they grew up in. The dream of owning a home wasn't just slipping away, it was being auctioned off to the highest bidder. And yet, officials kept insisting that population growth and immigration would keep demand strong forever. The arrogance was almost surreal. Meanwhile, household debt kept ballooning. Credit cards, car loans, and massive mortgages. Ontarians were living on borrowed money. Interest rates were rock bottom, so nobody worried. Why would they? The premier was on TV saying the market was solid, and the banks were still lending like it was a party that would never end. But it was a party built on borrowed time. Inflation was creeping up, the cost of everything from groceries to gas was rising, and the illusion of endless wealth was starting to wobble. By the time whispers of a slowdown began, it was already too late. The market had been built on confidence, and that confidence was starting to crack. What nobody wanted to admit was that Ontario's booming real estate wasn't fueled by stability. It was fueled by fear. Fear of missing out. Fear of being left behind. Fear that if you didn't buy today, you'd never afford to buy tomorrow. And once that fear shifted direction from missing out to losing everything, the entire system began to shake. Ontario's glittering skyline still looked invincible from afar, but behind those shiny glass towers, the cracks were spreading fast. The slow-motion collapse
declined by 72% year over year. Nationwide, the Canadian Real Estate Association found that total home sales decreased by nearly 10% over the same time period.
The fall didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly, quietly, like a bad rumor spreading through a crowded room. One month, bidding wars disappeared. The next, homes that once sold in days sat untouched for weeks. Sellers who once laughed at offers below asking were suddenly calling those same buyers back, ready to negotiate. The tone shifted fast, from cocky confidence to nervous smiles. By early 2023, the Ontario housing boom wasn't booming anymore. It was stalling. Interest rates had started to rise, and those tiny percentage increases everyone brushed off were turning into nightmares. Variable mortgage holders watched their payments skyrocket. Some families saw their monthly bills jump by thousands, money they didn't have, for homes they could barely afford. Suddenly, the same system that had made everyone rich was eating them alive. Buyers who had stretched every dollar to buy during the peak were underwater within months. Their houses were worth less than what they owed. Real estate agents, once flooded with calls, were now chasing clients who didn't want to sell because they couldn't afford to. The open houses were quiet. The excitement was gone. What used to be a feeding frenzy turned into a waiting game, everyone expecting prices to drop further. Confidence, the invisible fuel that kept Ontario's housing engine running, had evaporated. And then came the panic. Developers who had sold out entire condo towers years in advance started getting nervous. Some buyers walked away from their deposits, realizing their pre-construction units were now worth far less than what they agreed to pay. Tower after tower stood half-empty, their shiny windows reflecting a city that no longer believed in its own success. Construction sites slowed to a crawl, and cranes that once symbolized progress became eerie reminders of a dream gone wrong. In Toronto, the skyline still gleamed, but beneath it, the energy had shifted from ambition to anxiety. The suburbs were hit just as hard. Hamilton, Kitchener, and London, cities that had boomed when Toronto became too expensive, saw prices tumble 20 to 30% in months. Families who moved farther out for affordable homes were suddenly drowning in debt. The property they thought was their golden ticket became a financial trap. Mortgage defaults began to rise, and lenders were swamped with calls from desperate homeowners asking for relief. The emotional toll was brutal. People who once bragged about their home's worth were now avoiding conversations about real estate altogether. Social media, once filled with renovation posts and sold-over-asking signs, turned bleak. Stories of foreclosures and forced sales began to replace photos of dream homes. The premier, who had once stood proudly in front of cranes and ribbon cuttings, was now standing before microphones trying to explain why the market was crumbling. But even he couldn't stop the slide. Ontario's housing market had been built on confidence, credit, and endless optimism. And once that faith cracked, everything began to collapse in slow motion. The premier's breaking point.
Toronto's actual limit is 250 square feet.
Okay.
That's what the planning department has on the books, so it can go very small in Toronto, that's for sure.
At first, the premier tried to keep his cool. He brushed off concerns, calling the downturn temporary turbulence. But as the headlines grew harsher and the questions sharper, his confidence started to crack. Every press conference felt like walking into a storm. Reporters grilled him on why his government hadn't acted sooner to control prices, why so many families were drowning in debt, and why Ontario's so-called resilient market had suddenly imploded. The pressure was relentless, and one afternoon in early 2024, it finally got to him. Cameras caught the moment he snapped, his voice rising, face red, accusing journalists of fear-mongering. The clip went viral within hours, spreading across social media like wildfire. It wasn't just a political gaffe. It was a symbol of the province's unraveling confidence. After that, the anger spilled out everywhere. Homeowners who had bought during the peak started gathering outside Queen's Park, waving protest signs that read, "We lost everything," and "Mortgage prisoners." Families told heartbreaking stories of losing homes they had fought years to afford. When the premier showed up to meet them, it was supposed to be a chance to show empathy. Instead, it turned into another disaster. He told the crowd that markets go up and down, and that people needed to be responsible for their choices. It was a soundbite that would haunt him for months. The tone-deaf remark spread like wildfire, painting him as out of touch with the pain of everyday Ontarians. Inside the legislature, the atmosphere was just as tense. Opposition leaders tore into him, accusing his government of ignoring affordability warnings and allowing a speculative bubble to explode under their watch. During one heated debate, he slammed his fist on the desk and shouted that no one could have predicted this crash. The video played on loop across news networks. The image of a red-faced premier, visibly unraveling, became the defining picture of Ontario's housing collapse. Every outburst, every defensive comment, every flash of frustration only deepened the public's sense that their leader had lost control. In an effort to repair his image, he agreed to a televised town hall. It was meant to show calm leadership, a man ready to listen. But halfway through, when a tearful mother explained how her family lost their home, the premier's expression hardened. He looked impatient, even annoyed. That clip, too, went viral. People weren't just angry anymore. They were disappointed. The man who had once been the face of Ontario's booming prosperity was now the face of its collapse. By the end of 2024, his approval ratings were in free fall. Every time he appeared on camera, there was a tension in the air, a sense that another explosion could come at any second. Political allies kept their distance. Late-night hosts mocked his temper. Even his usual supporters began whispering that he looked broken. For years, he had stood as the proud defender of Ontario's real estate empire, smiling beside construction cranes, boasting about growth, promising stability. But as the towers emptied, the jobs vanished and the protests grew louder. That pride turned into panic. The premier wasn't just losing his composure. He was losing the one thing that had kept Ontario's dream alive, faith in its own leadership. Families in freefall.
We saw a number of layoffs within the housing industry, a key economic driver of the economy across the country, but certainly.
When the market finally crashed, it wasn't the developers or investors who took the worst hit. It was the families. Ordinary Ontarians who had done everything right, who believed in the promise of home ownership, suddenly found themselves drowning. Couples who had scraped together down payments, taken second jobs, or borrowed from parents were watching their dream homes turn into financial prisons. Monthly mortgage payments that once felt manageable had doubled or tripled as interest rates climbed. For many, it felt like they were working just to feed the bank. The emotional weight was unbearable. Parents skipped meals to cover bills. Marriages cracked under the strain. People stopped answering the door when mortgage collectors came knocking. In neighborhoods like Hamilton and London, the change was impossible to ignore. The same streets that buzzed with construction trucks and renovation projects just a few years earlier were eerily quiet. For sale signs stood like grave markers on every corner, their bright colors fading under months of sun. Some homeowners simply walked away, abandoning properties they could no longer afford. Others clung on, draining savings and retirement accounts just to buy time. The dream that had once defined Ontario, owning a home, building a future, had turned into a nightmare that no one could wake from. And renters didn't escape the fallout either. As homeowners fought to cover ballooning mortgages, many tried to offset costs by jacking up rents. Landlords pleaded they had no choice, but for tenants, it meant sudden eviction notices, impossible rent hikes, and overcrowded shelters. Ontario's rental crisis, already bad before the crash, exploded into chaos. Low-income families were pushed to the brink, shelters filled beyond capacity. Tent cities appeared in places they had never been seen before. The divide between those who owned homes and those who didn't had never felt wider or more bitter. The emotional damage was just as deep as the financial one. People who once saw their homes as symbols of safety began to view them as traps. Parents felt guilt for dragging their kids into something they couldn't sustain. Young buyers who had been told real estate is always a good investment felt betrayed by the system and by the leaders who swore everything was fine. Social media became an outlet for grief. Videos of families packing boxes in tears went viral. Comment sections filled with anger, some blaming the government, others blaming the banks, and many blaming themselves. The sense of unity Ontario once had during its boom years had vanished. Neighbors who used to chat about renovation plans now avoided eye contact. Communities felt heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional moving truck hauling away another family's dream. The province that once prided itself on prosperity and stability was now a patchwork of loss and resentment. Behind every foreclosure notice and for sale sign was a story of sacrifice, hope, and heartbreak. The housing market didn't just collapse, it took a part of Ontario's soul with it.
GTA, for example, in 2027 and 28, we're going to see even less housing coming on market, and it's going to increase the affordability challenges that we're all.
By the time 2025 rolled around, it was clear Ontario's housing collapse wasn't just a real estate problem. It was an economic earthquake. The province had built much of its prosperity on housing. Construction, renovations, mortgage lending, home furnishings, even local retail, all of it depended on people buying, selling, and moving. When that stopped, the ripple effects spread fast. Developers who once bragged about billion-dollar condo projects started canceling them overnight. Cranes froze mid-air across Toronto's skyline. Construction workers were laid off in waves, and contractors who used to be booked months in advance suddenly found themselves desperate for work. The hum of Ontario's biggest growth engine fell silent. It wasn't just the builders who suffered. The shock hit every corner of the economy. Furniture stores sat empty, renovation companies closed, and small-town hardware shops that thrived on home improvements saw their revenues cut in half. The banking sector tightened its grip too, terrified of rising defaults. Mortgage approvals became rare, and credit lines were slashed. Families who needed refinancing couldn't get it, forcing more into foreclosure. Businesses tied to housing, from appraisers to landscapers, watched demand evaporate. For the first time in over a decade, Ontario's job numbers began to sink, dragging consumer confidence down with them. The Premier, once so proud of the province's resilient market, was unraveling under the pressure. Every appearance was a reminder of failure. Viral clips of him lashing out at critics became daily news fodder. His once proud slogan about Ontario's unstoppable growth was being mocked in memes. Polls showed trust in his leadership collapsing alongside home prices. Even his own allies were starting to distance themselves. The optics were brutal. Photos of half-built towers, shuttered construction sites, and angry homeowners lined up outside government offices filled the evening news. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below.